Well, hi, everybody. Thank you for joining us again this week for our ShawLocal.com Bears Insider podcast. I am Hub Arkush, along with our Shaw Media Group sports editor, Kyle Nabors, and our ShawLocal.com Bears Insider beat reporter, Sean Hammond. And guys, it's too bad there's no news this week. Nothing really to talk about. I don't know where folks want us to go right now. So for those of you just joining us, you're all just joining us because, of course, we're just starting. Thank you so much for being with us. I want to remember right off the top again to thank our great sponsors from Heinz Lumber. Since 1892, 11 great locations around Chicago for all of your building contracting needs. You're thinking about an addition, just some home projects, just working on the honey-do list. Find the Heinz Lumber location nearest you. It is the only place to go for all of your homeowners and building supplies needs. And we also just want to thank you for being here. It really is fun getting to visit with you. If you are following us on Twitter or on YouTube, you can join the conversations. Just send us your questions. We'd love to hear what's on your mind, and that way we know we're getting you the information you want. So we'll be watching that line as we talk. And there was a bit of a debate coming in, folks. Well, do we start with all of the Bears team news coming out of veteran minicamp? Or do we talk about all the front office news and this bomb that was dropped Thursday afternoon that, the Bears are bidding on the Arlington Park racecourse 326-acre property? So I think that the consensus was, well, let's start with Arlington Heights. Send us your questions and we will respond in any way you like. And maybe just an initial thought, guys. This is where I don't know if it's an advantage or not, but being like 5 times as old as anybody else, I wrote in my column yesterday. I didn't realize this until I don't know what made me think of it walking the dogs the other night. But this is going to be my 45th year on the Bears beat, and one of the very first stories I covered was George Halas announcing that he was threatening to move the Bears to Arlington Heights. And so, while it caught us all off guard, and it is going to be, conversation provoking and thought provoking, we've been dealing with this for 5 decades now. And I think that, back in the day, in the 70s and the 80s, 90s, when we talked about this, Sean, it was probably a 1 in a million shot. I'd say this time it's only a 1 in 1,000 shot. I think they've improved their odds by 100,000, if you will. But it still has so far to go, and there are so many layers here. But it is interesting that the whole city reacts when we start to talk about this again.
Yeah, it's a hot button issue, here in the Chicago area. I don't think it's totally a surprise that the Bears are at least seeking out their options here. I mean, how many locations of this size and just this, how many locations of this size come available for sale? It doesn't happen all that frequently, so you can't blame them for at least wanting to see what's there and whether or not this is something they're interested in. As you said, this doesn't mean that something's going to happen. This doesn't mean that the Bears are going to be the winning bid. It doesn't mean that if they are, that they're going to build a stadium, but it's the first step. And certainly if they're trying to, whether they're serious about moving to Arlington or not, whether they're just trying to get a little bit of leverage to make some improvements at Soldier Field, I think from the Bears' perspective, it makes sense that they're interested in this.
Kyle, it is intriguing to Sean's point because it's a 326-acre property. Now, started to dig in and do so. I mean, I've been researching this my whole career, but especially now in the last 24 hours. And apparently, the average stadium platform, if you will, or area starts at about 100 acres. There's some that are on a little bit less, but somewhere between 80 and 120 acres is kind of what you're looking for. Now, when you look at, for instance, SoHi in Los Angeles, which Stan Kroenke just built, and keep in mind, he is the wealthiest owner in the NFL, and he is a real estate developer. That is more the size of Arlington, but that's because it's a $5 billion development, of which only $2.2 billion was the stadium. There was $3 billion spent on commercial property, on condos and apartments, on brick and mortar retail. So there's a lot else that can come with this. And I think that, and the fact that even though they'd clearly knock everything down, but when you realize that there is the main grandstand there that I'm guessing could probably hold 30, 35,000, no, probably a little bit less than that, whatever it may be, there is some infrastructure already there as well, So it is if you have the ability and the wherewithal to build a new state-of-the-art, sports complex, then it's the perfect property in some respects. We'll get to why it's not as perfect as people think in a couple minutes. And so, to Sean's point, the Bears would be silly not to at least kick the tires.
Absolutely. I mean, you mentioned it in your column last night. I mean, there are many things that make you question the viability of this project, including the finances, which I'm sure we're going to get into a little bit more, whether that's the McCaskey's personal finances, the potential cost to the taxpayer. But just from a pure why would you do it perspective, yeah, that is a large site. It is perfect if you want to build a stadium that can, host a Final Four or host a Super Bowl. More importantly, though, as we've seen across not just the NFL, but pretty much every stadium being built for right now, is you just don't want to have a stadium. You want a community around that stadium. These teams are maximizing their profits in terms of building. I think of the one in St. Louis that the Cardinals built. I think it's called Ballpark Village, right? They own all that property. They're taking a cut out of all the restaurants, all the very high priced beer sales that are happening after a Cardinals game. Having that flexibility, and then it's a large enough site you can put condos and stuff on it. And another thing you mentioned in your column that I think is interesting. We don't know what the absolute future of the Bears is in terms of the ownership. There's always been speculation about potential sale. It could be that they're just looking to buy that land. That's very, very attractive for anyone, a potential, anyone that would potentially want to buy the Bears, to have that, at least have that option. And, if they don't build a stadium, some wealthy person has a very, very nice parcel of land to build on anything, really.
Sean, we've never had this conversation, but I'm going to guess that Kyle is more Sox fan than Cubs fan, because really the better example here than the Cardinals is the Cubs and what they've just done with Wrigleyville. They bought everything up. A lot of Cubs fans, yours truly included, and I am a season ticket holder, are less than pleased about it, because it really was more to the benefit of ownership than it was to the fans, in my opinion. And I'm already trying to seeing the congestion and the cost of it all. But it is what is happening in professional sports these days, and I really think, with more time to think about this, I think something that Kyle just touched on is the most likely scenario. The going rate for an NFL state-of-the-art stadium these days is about $2 billion. The two newest are SoFi, which I just mentioned, out in Inglewood in Los Angeles. Now, it was a $5.5 billion project, but the stadium itself is reported at about $2.2 billion. Allegiant Stadium, which the Raiders just finished in Las Vegas, is $2 billion. So that's kind of the number you got to work with. But what's interesting, I mentioned Kroenke, the richest owner in the NFL. Davis may be there's no paupers, there's no poor people here, but he may be the least wealthy, if you will. And I don't know anything about the McCaskey's personal finances, but it's really safe to assume that they're more in the Davis neighborhood than the Kroenke neighborhood. Well, Davis, to build his stadium, had to get $750 million in taxpayer money from the city of Las Vegas and the state of Nevada, and then still had to find another $1.2 billion. So before we talk about the other $1.2 billion, what does anybody think, with the current state of play in the state of Illinois or Cook County or whatever it may be, the taxpayers are going to pony up $750 million to build a sports complex for the Bears?
Yeah, you know that they're going to ask for that, or I don't know the number per se, but they're going to ask for public money, and that's going to be, if this does move along here in the next couple of years, that's going to be a real topic of discussion among people, and how much how much is the public willing to fund something like this? Because yes, you could draw a Super Bowl, you could draw the Final Four, et cetera, all those big events, but those only come around, once every 5 to 10 years or whatnot. Really, this would be, primarily for the Bears, and sure, you could have concerts and stuff, but how much is the public going to be willing to fund that? And there's going to be a lot of hoops to jump through to get that done, no matter what the price is.
Well, and Kyle, here's the thing. I would not downplay, and I'm not suggesting Kyle was, I would not downplay the value of concerts and, monster truck jams and whatever else you want to do in this thing, because again, the premise is that you're not just going to put them in the stadium and generate ticket revenue. You're going to build this entertainment complex around it and take additional revenue out of every mass gathering at this stadium. And let's say that you build a 78,000 seat stadium with a retractable roof. You may not get 78,000 to every event like you would for a Bears game, but there's a lot of acts that will still put 50, 60, 70,000 people in a stadium, be it Garth Brooks or, I don't even know with rock and roll anymore who the hottest touring bands are. But there certainly are folks out there who can still, drive that kind of crowd. And what's interesting now is I think we know that the McCaskies just don't have the financial wherewithal to do this, but it is quite possible that there's at this stage a silent or anonymous partner out there who is a real estate developer or does control a major hedge fund or is simply another Kroenke who wants in. It could be, maybe there's a Mark Cuban, who could write the check to build the whole thing and in exchange get a buy-sell agreement where if the team is ever sold, it's his. There are different ways to do this. And so if the McCaskies are prepared to bring on an operating partner of that level, and if there's somebody out there, then this becomes a much more real conversation.
Yeah. Really quickly, Groovy Porky is asking about a timeline, which is something we can talk about. We'll get to that question in just a few minutes, Groovy, because Hub makes some good points about the finances, and that is one side. I mean, there could be private capital that comes in. The other side of this is the public side, right? We've seen, this is a trend in the NFL. It's a trend across all sports leagues of public financing using, bonds and stuff. And I think our initial reaction is to immediately dismiss that because of the state of finances in Illinois. We're just coming out of a pandemic where we know that absolutely put a budget crunch in. I will say this though, we shouldn't downplay we shouldn't downplay the financial implications for the state because of the political reasons. And when I say that is, you're talking about this is all speculation, right? All of this we're talking about today is speculation, but we're now halfway through the first term of Governor J.B. Pritzker. He has taken a lot of heat because of his handling of the pandemic, whether you believe that is warranted or not. We don't know if he's even going to run again, but there is there's going to be a lot of political haggling and they're going to be trying to game out what side of this they want to fall on. Does the governor give support if he can frame it as this is economic development within the northwest suburbs, an area that needs it, an area that honestly is pretty split Democrat Republican. We've seen that in recent elections. Even the House seats are pretty close. That matters, and that political play is going to come into that, whether it gets an endorsement from state government or not.
Well, yeah. And Kyle, it's interesting because it's going to be a very popular political position with some, and it's going to be very unpopular with others, depending on who their constituency is and where they are. And you make a great point about issuing bonds. The problem, of course, with those bonds is when they go bad, they still fall back on the taxpayers to make them good.
Right.
So it really is public money. It's just, you're just getting at it a different way. And you're taking whatever bond revenue is raised for the stadium away from bonds that could be raised to deal with your other problems anyway. So the fact that the state is in a financial crisis is not something that we can look askance at, and it's going to make this trickier. But that's why I suspect very strongly, Sean, that the McCaskies, again, there's two possibilities for them. One is, I think Sean alluded to it, because I'm kind of beginning to think this is the most likely possibility. First of all, let's be clear on something. As this was reported earlier in the week in the Daily Herald, who of course is our partner publication. Most of Sean's and my, maybe all of our content is available with the Daily Herald and the Paddock publications, as well as all of our great Shaw Media publications. And they reported earlier in the week that according to Churchill Downs, the only statement they made is that there have been numerous inquiries and there are numerous interested parties. The Bears bid apparently went in just before the deadline on Tuesday evening. we have no idea if this is even a serious bid. I mean, again, Ted says, well, we owe it to ourselves to look. Yeah, he's right. They do owe it to themselves to kick the tires. I'm sure that they had consultation with somebody who knows what they're doing before they just made an arbitrary bid. But at the end of the day, there could be a bunch of private money out there that wants to do it independent of the Bears and then come to the Bears with an offer once they get it open. Or there could be, that 326 acres may be able to be developed more profitably without a sports stadium in there, so you have no idea who's bidding on this and what the Bears' chances of getting it are. But let's say they get it. Let's say they're the high bidder. Even if it goes to a couple $100 million, they could probably handle that. And I think that right now it may be as simple as a buy and hold, because while I don't believe the team is for sale now or in the immediate future, it's going to get sold at some point. And if you own that property, that asset, you've dramatically, enhanced the value of the Chicago Bears organization.
Yeah, Hub, you wrote that in your column yesterday, and I thought that was a really good point because that's going to make the Bears a lot more attractive to potential buyers if the team ever does come for sale, and like you mentioned as well, there's a lot of things you could do on land of that size. So who knows what other bids are out there? We're really just at the beginning process of this. I don't know if you guys saw flying around social media yesterday, somebody superimposed Soldier Field onto the map of the land, and it didn't even take up the whole infield of the racetrack. So you're talking about a ton of land that you can fit the entire Soldier Field in just one little portion of it, and they could build something. They could build a huge stadium and still have so much space left over to build some of those other things that we're talking about.
We really don't have any idea either how substantial, not just serious, but how substantial these bids and proposals are. Churchill Downs has said that they're going to remain confidential as they start to evaluate them. Like, we don't know, exactly how in depth the Bears have gone or any of these projects have gone. You know what I mean? And Sean, you wrote about it, and I think it's common knowledge. And we got that idea. Mayor Lori Lightfoot made it very clear that the Bears have been negotiating for upgrade that Soldier Field. So if this is really just the first round of proposals where there didn't have to be a ton of legwork, but the Bears were like, why wouldn't we throw our names in the hat if we're already, trying to get some work done at Soldier Field? Use that as leverage. I mean, it's hard to tell how serious this actually is.
Kyle, that was exactly the next point that I was going to go to. And this is, again, where you look at the historical part of this story. Listen, I don't know if Lori Lightfoot's a good mayor or a bad mayor. I don't know what different people think about her. What I know is that I like her because I think she's really smart and she's really tough. Now, whether she's used those two assets to be a good mayor or not, I leave that to somebody else. I don't live in the city of Chicago. But I did find it interesting. And again, I think this is because she is smart and tough, that she didn't waste any time. It was within a couple hours of Ted's statement being released that she pointed out that the Bears have done this continually. Whenever we're in negotiations with them on Soldier Field, they threaten to move somewhere else. And I can tell you, having covered this for almost 5 decades now, that is true. And we do know that they've been in some negotiation with the city for improvements to Soldier Field. We do know that strange tweet came from Albert Breer about 2-3 weeks ago where he said the league had improved this stadium financing. And then he immediately had to correct it and say it was only $15 million for part of a scoreboard project or something like that. But now you begin to wonder, were they talking about something else? What was going on there? I don't know the answer to that one, but what I do know is that this has been a tactic that the Hallis McCaskey family has used forever. I don't know. I mean, obviously George is the chairman. He's involved in this, but my sense is this is Ted Phillips's job. People get really upset when Ted gets involved in football with good cause because he hasn't been very good at it, but he has done a nice job of making them a lot of money. This is his job to oversee from the operating standpoint. I think this is more him than George. But it is a tradition with the Bears that it seems like whenever they're negotiating with the city, they threaten to move. And I'm not saying that this is that simple, but you can't ignore that possibility either.
Here's something that we got Robbie's popping in. Nice to see him back in here. A Jerry World Bears World type. You mentioned that, but Robbie mentions that. Hub, in your column, you talked about yesterday that Jerry Jones actually doesn't own AT&T Stadium. He owns everything around it, essentially. Now, I don't know how AT&T, I haven't looked into it close enough to see how that was financed. No,
I did.
It's Texas. It's Texas, so I assume it was public money. But
Texas decided that building a stadium for Jerry Jones was more important than keeping their power grid working. So
it's kind of what I assumed.
There was over $1 billion in public money.
Now I wonder if there could be some type of where the Bears don't own the stadium but own everything around it, that type of situation.
Well, there's all kinds of possibilities, and this is why I come back to, I think this is a really smart move by them, because if they can just buy the property, and let's say it costs $250 million, and no, I've never even thought about seeing that in one place. I'm not pretending it's not a ton of money, but they own a $3.5 billion asset. They've been in the business 100 years. I assume the family has put aside some money. I assume they have some investments, and just out of operating capital, they could probably cover a loan for that. So if they just could get the property, then there's time to figure out what you're going to do with it, whether you can actually ever build a stadium or not. And the value of that property is probably not going to go down, so it could just be a good investment that they never get around to building a stadium on. It could be that simple.
Yeah. We talked about, you mentioned the value of that property is not going to go down. And this is where we get back into the long-term, how long will the McCaskey family hold on to this franchise? Because right now, as anyone who's looked into the housing market over the last 6 months knows, land prices, everything is through the roof. That's eventually going to dip back down, right? It just naturally has to do that. So you don't want to buy it at the top. And if the McCaskies want to sell it 2-3 years from now, if there is a dip, I do wonder about that. So it's hard to figure out a timeline. And I guess this is where I'm going to bring that Groovy question in here, Groovy Porky's question. How long would it take to build a stadium? How long did it take LA to do it? And I think the place we have to start, and then I'll throw it back to you, Hub, is Churchill Downs. It sounded like it's probably at least 6 to 8 weeks, if not longer, before we even have an update from them. They just have the proposals. They said they're going to remain confidential as they begin to review them. So,
yeah, and who knows what these proposals look like and who they're from and how competitive they are. I thought it was interesting. Again, a different story that I read in the Daily Herald. Arlington Heights Mayor Tom Hayes has made some statements to try and indicate that they would like to be able to impact the decision here, and that their job is to get the best possible new owners and investors for Arlington Heights. Well, unless I'm missing something, the mayor has nothing to do with it. He doesn't own the property, and I don't think that there's any way he could really block a deal. Now, some of these potential investors, Sean, could be basing it on getting certain commitments from the city, the county, the state for infrastructure. There is always infrastructure that goes with these buildings. At some point, it's going to cost something from the taxpayers. But usually the infrastructure part of it can be done in the first 100 million or so. And again, yes, that's all the money in the world to most of us. But in projects like this, well, do the math. If it's a $2 billion, stadium, you're only talking about 5% for the infrastructure. And that's something I'm sure, they'd work out with Illinois, even if the private investors ended up paying for it or reimbursing for it. They might even offer to do extra work to enhance some of the infrastructure around the other parts of Arlington Heights. But the timeline, guys, right now, the other part that people want to make part of the story that I don't really think is part of the story is that the Bears lease at Soldier Field does run through 2033. The issue there, though, is that the rent is only $6.5 million, and I can't believe that there's anything in that lease that says that the Bears are penalized if they don't actually use the stadium. They just have to pay the rent, even though the city does get a fair amount of the parking and concession revenue, or at least taxes on it. So what I'm getting at is you got 12 years left on the lease at $6.5 million. You do the math, you're talking another $75-80 million. if you're building, you get the money to build a $2 billion stadium, you can get the other 75, 80 million just to buy your way out of the lease. Mayor Lightfoot says that the league won't let them break it. No, they won't let them break it, but I can promise you this. If the Bears find a way to build a state-of-the-art, sports complex in the city of Chicago, Roger Goodell's going to drive the moving trucks. He's not going to try and stop them. This is what the NFL is all about.
Yeah, the Soldier Field lease, I'm with you on that, Hub. It's never really, in my opinion, been much of a concern. I mean, if they really want to make this happen, they'll find a way to make it happen. No matter what the cost of breaking that lease is. And to get back to the timeline question, I was actually just looking this up. So SoFi Stadium in Los Angeles broke ground in November 2016. Now the plan was originally to open in 2019. And they had some record rainfall one of those years, which actually slowed it down a whole year. So that opened in summer 2020. So that's about 4 years with a delay. And Allegiant Stadium in Vegas was a similar. They actually completed the roughly 3-year plan. They broke ground in November 2017 and opened last summer, July 2020. So obviously we don't even have a blueprint. We don't even know what exactly they're trying to build at this point, if they are trying to build something. But once you got those plans in place, it looks like it's theoretically possible to do that within about a 3-year time span.
Yeah, the difference being, though, that's break ground. Kroenke basically just bought the land he wanted. In Vegas, they worked on this for a year and a half or two just to be able to get the commitment to break ground. And in this particular case, because of the complications, they do have a lease, even though they shouldn't have any trouble, handling that as part of the project. I think best case, you're talking 5 years here. I think we're going to be discussing this probably till the opening of training camp next year before we even know, if it's a possibility. In the meantime, you can't ignore the idea, Kyle, that this is a negotiating tactic, and this could fast track conversations with the city. And we could hear in 6 months that, the Bears are doing both, that they've made a deal, with Mayor Lightfoot, and they still want to buy the property because it still makes sense to buy the property. So we can't, was it Groovy Porky or Porky Groovy? I can't remember.
Groovy Porky.
Yeah, the handle's okay, and you're a good-looking guy, but you get that butt out of your mouth, you're going to kill yourself, man. So, we see your avatars when you pop up here too. I can't imagine that there's any actual news about this that isn't changeable. Any final decisions or anything close to a groundbreaking ceremony in the next couple of years. So we're going to stay on it. There's all kinds of interesting angles with it, but I think, guys, we're almost a half hour in, and there's been a ton of football news this week too. So unless there's anything you guys want to add on the Arlington Heights story, it might be time to talk a little bit about some of the issues going on with the Bears coming out of their veteran minicamp.
No, I think it's a good time to pivot, and we actually have a good question to go ahead and make that pivot with, because as we were discussing on the pre-show, talking about Eddie Goldman, and we got a question in here. So, Hub, I'll let you take it away.
Okay, well, Chicago Sports Fan has a cap-related Eddie Goldman story, and it's how much cap would the Bears get back if Eddie Goldman retires? And the answer is, I don't think they get any of it back, or at least not most of it, because it's the dead cap money is basically the prorated portion of the signing bonus, and they already spent that. And they've already had the advantage of it not counting against the cap in the first, I think, 3 years of this deal. So there'd be some cap saving. Obviously, he wouldn't get his base salary. He might have even, there might be some, well, no, I don't think there'd be any bonus money to get. I don't know how the bonus money works. This is where then there's grievances, and it ends up with an arbitrator as to some portion of that might have to come back. But in the short term, which is, I think, is where you're probably looking, because, the Bears do still have cap issues. In the short term, I don't think it would be necessarily a big help. Just the fact that they were able to sign Jake Butt and Mike Pennell, Pennell at least is getting the veteran minimum for him as a 7 or 8 year vet. I think it's got to be about $1 million. And then, you just got Tevin Jenkins and Justin Fields done. They had about $8.5 million in space before they did the 2 rookies. I'm going to guess those deals ate up about $3 million, probably another million at least between Pennell and Butt. So they may have $3 or $4 million to play with. If they got a couple million back from Goldman, it would be helpful, Sean. But I don't think it's going to have a big impact on the cap, or at least not an impact to match the negative impact it could have on the defense by not having them.
Yeah, looking at over the cap, and I know this isn't always perfect, but they have them at about $5 million in space right now. But yeah, it's I mean, I wasn't surprised. I mean, I guess it was a bit of a surprise to see Eddie Goldman not there, but also it wasn't at the same time. I don't know, Hub, what do you make of this whole situation with him not showing up again? We haven't seen him in a year and a half.
Guys, I was hoping for the best until the news this morning of these latest roster signings, and I guess I buried the lead there. I mean, I'm not sure when you're listening to this podcast, but we're recording on Friday morning, a little later in the week than usual, but we didn't want to go before the veteran minicamp was over. And it was announced early this morning that the Bears have signed 3 more players and waived 2. You've probably never heard of the 2 they waived. It was not significant. But they have signed Jake Butt, the former All-American tight end from Michigan, who was with the Denver Broncos. And they've signed Mike Pennell, who has been a quality nose tackle in the NFL, both in Green Bay and Kansas City. And I think originally with the Jets, I could be wrong about that. I just am doing that from memory. And I was hoping for the best with Goldman. I was hoping that there might be some technical issues with having opted out that he hadn't opted in yet, that there was various ways to get away with that. Matt Nagy kind of nipped that in the bud on Wednesday when he confirmed it was an unexcused absence at a mandatory minicamp. So theoretically, he can be fined the full $93,000 for not being there. If he's willing to eat that fine, having not made his money last year. Remember, he got a stipend. For opting out. I want to say the veteran stipend was $300,000, but he was scheduled to earn about $10 million. So it's hard to imagine taking another $90,000 hit unless there's a real issue here. And then when they announced this morning they've signed this veteran, Mike Pennell, that tells me that they're worried. I mean, they wouldn't acknowledge it. They tried to give us a sense of confidence, but. Kyle, I don't know how to read it any other way.
It's hard. Well, yeah, I mean, that's the only way you can read it when they're making a signing like that. And I don't know what your guys' thoughts on it. It's been a few years since I've had any interaction with Eddie. He's always kind of been, at least mercurial might be the right word. I'm not saying he's a bad guy, a bad teammate, anything like that, but he's always been kind of a quiet, reserved guy that I don't know. Is a bit of an oddball too strong of a way to say it? Like,
no, it's better than mercurial, because I think you're more on track with the quiet and reserved, and it's kind of hard to be quiet and reserved and mercurial. But I mean,
that's true.
Yeah, I think strange is a way to put it. Maybe just kind of close to the vest. He's a nice guy. He's very pleasant when you talk to him. He's not unfriendly or threatening. He just doesn't want to let you in.
It's hard.
Maybe private is the way to put it.
It's hard. It's hard to get a read on what he's actually thinking.
Mm-hmm. And he's private on social media too. I mean, he has a Twitter and an Instagram account, but I don't think he's posted on there in years. So that's for a lot of guys, that's their way of reaching people, and it isn't for him.
No, it's a strange situation because, and Matt ended up, Matt Nagy, with some egg on his face, and it wasn't his fault. But, he had just told us last week or the week before that Eddie had been in the facility and that he looked great and he was ready to go, and they were excited to have him back. And it was going to be asked about regardless. But I think it made the no-show even that much more of a story, because he had just talked about how great it was to see him and how good he looked. And then this time to be somewhat mysterious about it, almost suggesting that they weren't even sure themselves what was going on. And again, you got to be careful with this stuff, guys. And I know social media and sports talk radio has changed all this, but in fairness to them, everything they say has the ability to come back and bite them. And so I understand, why they're going to be a little evasive and a little quiet about this until they have some final resolution. But by saying as little as possible, they I think, Sean, have probably made it appear to the public a little more negative than it needs to be or should be.
Yeah, and Nagy said something to the effect of he expects Eddie to show up ready to rock and roll for training camp, and I have a hard time just believing that at this point. I don't know if they know whether he's going to show up or not.
It makes no sense.
It doesn't make any sense.
Why would a guy who, as I just said, gave up roughly $9 million in salary last year for a personal decision to opt out, which I completely respect.
Nobody is. I think is.
At the time he did it, I was surprised more players weren't opting out based on what we knew about COVID at the time. So, that part of it's fine, but we know what happens sometimes when players step away. Either they get terribly out of shape or they find other interests or whatever. But to say that we're in touch and that he's coming, and they said he's excited and everything, and then 2 weeks later to take a $90,000 hit to not show up to a mandatory veteran camp, and then to say, but we're comfortable, he's going to be ready to rock and roll for training camp, based on what? They do not have to fine him. It's a mandatory camp. They can fine him. Now, if they fine him, the rules change does not allow them to forgive that fine down the road, but they don't have to fine him for this. So that's their one kind of saving grace in the background here. Maybe they are talking, I don't know, but they would do themselves a favor by at least sharing a little bit of it with us, so we're not getting all this negative speculation.
Well, and this really is where it comes into play with the needing to be able to have access back for the locker rooms, right? We'd have a much better feel for what is actually happening right now if our reporters were back in the locker room, which it does sound like we've made some progress on that in the last week. So that's a positive. But, when all you're doing is you're getting guys on Zoom, you're getting the coaches on Zoom. You're not, it's not an open locker room where we can see guys coming and going, even if they're avoiding us, you know what I mean? Like, at least they're there. Like, they're saying, yeah, well, he's been in the building. We don't actually know that, right? I mean, have you guys seen Eddie Goldman in the building?
No, we don't know that.
I would say, yeah, it's where the media is working is away from where the players are. So, I mean, we'll probably have a much better read if we actually ever get back into locker rooms.
Yeah, now you got me on the spot. I actually know a little bit more about that than pretty much anybody in town, because I'm the president of the Chicago chapter of the Pro Football Writers Association, and have gotten some information in just the last couple of days that is less than enjoyable, if you will. But there are still negotiations going on, and I think it's a little premature to get into it. Again, I don't want to burn anybody here. What has been announced publicly is that the plan is for the beginning of training camp to do away with the Zoom conferences and to be able to do in-person interviews, some one-on-one, while distanced outside. So on the field, the locker room issue is a real hot button right now. Again, I'm just going to stop there because it's getting negotiated, and we're going to know more about it in a month or two, if not a few weeks. What the league has announced is the training camp and exhibition season or preseason protocol. And so the plan is to allow fully vaccinated media into the media room with a limit, with a maximum capacity, which we're still working out. Appropriately distanced, but at least for the training camp and preseason, we will not be allowed in the locker room, but we will be able to talk to players in person for the first time on the field. So that is a very long-winded way of getting back to, Kyle, we saw everybody who was outside, and we assumed that was everybody through the OTAs and minicamp. Robert Quinn was not participating, but watching on Tuesday. He was not out there on Wednesday, but then was back on the field Thursday. So the answer is we probably would have seen Eddie if he was around at some point, but we didn't have to worry about it because they told us he wasn't there, and he was the only veteran who wasn't there.
Yeah. Yeah. And just some notes here on some of these other guys. Anthony Miller was also there, but not fully participating, and it sounds like Bilal Nichols is dealing with some sort of minor toe injury. I think we saw him tweak something on Tuesday, and then was not back in practice. But I don't think either of those are anything to worry about at this point.
Yeah, Matt actually did specify that Bilal did it on Tuesday, that they're just going to be careful with it. With Robert Quinn, they said it was a lower back thing that they're being overly conservative on. I wasn't clear. Was that an ankle from a couple weeks ago? Or I think
I don't know that they ever said. That was the one that Nagy called. He said something to the effect of he had a nick.
Mm-hmm,
Well,
guys, I think the one in here, and then we'll get to the defense and then the quarterback situation, because all of this was hot topics this week. But with Robert Quinn, I just think the concern here is that he wasn't a complete disaster, but he was disappointing last year based on what they paid him and what you hope to get out of him, which was double-digit sacks. And throughout the entire training camp and first 4, 5, 6 weeks of the season, there was this, minor, we're being conservative, we're babying it. He wasn't practicing. We wouldn't see him some days. We couldn't understand it. Robert's a good guy, but he's a different cat. I mean, when you talk to him a little bit, I mean, it just depends on what day and what mood you catch him in, and he can be a little different, is the word I'll use. And so now the first mini camp to have the same thing happening again, when clearly he is one of the 3, 4 most important, improvements they need to get this defense back where it was. It just the same thing as Goldman. It's hard not to be a little bit concerned about it.
Yeah, it's not promising, and it certainly is concerning. I mean, you hope that a month from now he's good to go come training camp, but we've seen this, again and again over the last year, and who knows what shape he's going to be in when they open camp.
So, Kyle, two impressive things, and then whatever you want to add, or if you want to comment on this, but from being out there for 3 days, and then we'll obviously get to the quarterbacks. But my biggest takeaway from the defense, watching them the last 3 days, my 2 biggest takeaways, it's not phony or PR or propaganda. The veterans on defense are happy with Sean Desai. One of the things you had to wonder about is, how is this young guy with only 8 years NFL experience, only 2 years as a position coach, going to be the best choice as the coordinator? But the veterans, to a man, have stepped up and said, yeah, he's the guy. He's the guy we wanted. He's Vic's guy. We're going to do all the stuff that we were doing in 18 and early in 19 before we started to get away from some of it. So they're excited about that. And the other thing that really impressed me, there is no Kyle Fuller out there. There's no question about that. But there is some real competition that's going to go on in the secondary, and it's amongst some pretty decent football players. I think Jalen Johnson showed us enough to be excited about his future. He's going to be starting, probably still on the right side. And then you look at Kyle's spot, and clearly Desmond Trufant was signed to play it. But the most impressive guy in 3 days of minicamp was Kendall Vildor. I mean, this kid kept flashing. He had a couple picks one day, both of them, I think, both off Fields, both off Dalton. I can't remember now. But he was really impressive out there. And then you look at Desmond Trufant and Artie Burns and Tease Tabor. These guys are all first and second round draft picks, and they're all competing for the same spot. And then you plug in, the rest of the younger guys. There is plenty of competition in the secondary. I'm not sure that I'm not more worried at this point about Eddie Jackson bouncing back to being Eddie Jackson than I am about who's going to play cornerback.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Kyle.
No, it's good to hear that report about Kendall. When we wrapped up last week, I believe he was my player to watch, or breakout player in the secondary. You've heard that our friend Eric Edholm, I saw him tweet last night that Kendall Vildor was really impressive over the last few days. And it's funny, you mentioned Eddie Goldman, and right before you had done that, Robbie popped back in asking about Eddie Jackson if he could play like last year. So I think you're right. You're seeing pretty good competition at the cornerback spot. I feel better about it after these last 3 days. The question may be, what are you getting out of your veterans more than Eddie Jackson? But to circle back quickly with the Sean Desai thing, it's not surprising to hear that they're buying in. He's a really smart, well-spoken guy. The question is going to come that first time during the season when maybe that defense has a couple really rough week stretch to see, if he's able to rally the troops. You always worry about veteran players tuning out coaches, and with him having a little less experience, that will be a concern. But for now, things seem to be good on that end.
I do think there's a little bit of a feeling of from those veteran defenders who have been here a few years of he's one of us sort of with Sean Desai. I mean, Eddie Jackson was saying that when he first got to Chicago, Sean Desai was the guy teaching him the defense. They've been through this together. He was a guy behind the scenes for a number of years before this. So I think they feel really comfortable with him at the helm.
Yeah, I think they do. And, guys, I also think maybe the best signing of the offseason was Mike Pettin. I got into a conversation with somebody the other day, and now I'm drawing a blank on who it was, but it was kind of another, NFL veteran analyst who made the point that he wasn't sure that had Mike Pettin gotten fired 2 weeks earlier, that Pettin wouldn't be the defensive coordinator, and that as soon as he was on the street, knowing how young and inexperienced Sean is, the Bears grabbed him to come in and be a defensive assistant. But whatever led to it, and whoever is the coordinator, I think having Pettin alongside Desai, I'm pretty comfortable with that now. You got to remember Mike Pettin, part of his growing process in the NFL was in Baltimore on the same staff with Vic Fangio, and they learned together everything that became the bedrock of Vic's defenses. And one of the reasons that Sean Desai has been such a popular choice is that Chuck Pagano is a great football coach, and it's not that he did a bad job, but it's all about what your strength is. And Vic Fangio's strength, what separates him from everybody else, what makes him the best defensive mind in the game right now, is not only his ability to design different looks and different zone coverages, but his ability to disguise them and mix them up so that quarterbacks and opposing offensive coordinators often don't know what's coming. That apparently is the main thrust of what Sean Desai learned from him, and that is something that Pettin and Fangio worked on together in their time in Baltimore. And so I would argue there may be more talent here than there was in 2018. What worries me a little bit about it is 4 of them are now in their early 30s, and none of them were 3 years ago. Now, that's not the wall for defensive players. A lot of guys are still in all-pro form at 30, 31, 32. But something you got to keep an eye on. So I don't think the defense is aging, Kyle, but it's definitely middle-aged. And I think there's reason to be optimistic that they could have another special defensive season.
I think so. I'm going to throw this question up here because it was just asked and you were kind of talking about, is Khalil Mack on the decline? I'm not willing to go that far. He's still young enough and he's been productive enough that I don't think you can say that yet. I think there are reasons for concern coming off last year, the injuries a little bit too. Got to stay healthy. Obviously, it gets harder with age. I do want to go back here quickly and get your guys' opinion on this because we had a question when we were talking about cornerbacks, and I'm not sure we mentioned him. It was from a race to hate here. What about Roberson at cornerback? Do you guys anything to report? How do you look at camp the last few days?
Let me just jump back real quick for I think it was Corey, I Am Legend, who was asking about Khalil, and Corey, this is where you gotta kind of look at some tape and. When you study the tape week in and week out, what you'll see is Robert Quinn wasn't as completely incompetent as people think. He was actually very active. He just never finished and never gave you the sacks he wanted, and was not as good as he had been in a couple of years prior. But then you look at Khalil. The guy is battling double and triple teams on every snap, and still is a second team All-Pro, outside linebacker. And then, you talk to him, you look at his work ethic. No, I don't think that if Khalil Mack has lost anything, maybe he's 99%, 99.5, worst case 98.9. And I'm not even sure he's lost that. I expect him, if Eddie Goldman is back and is Eddie Goldman, and if Robert Quinn is back and is Robert Quinn, then Sean, I expect Khalil Mack to make a run at another defensive MVP award.
Yeah, that's the key. I think in my opinion, if you get somebody on that other side opposite Khalil Mack who can be a disruptor and draw some attention from that offensive line, that's only going to make things easier for Khalil Mack. And you're right, he's facing all these double teams because teams don't have to worry about what's coming on the other side as much as you would maybe want if you're the Bears.
And this goes into the conversation we were just having about Sean Desai and using more pressure and being more creative with where that pressure is coming from. You start doing that, teams can't focus on Khalil Mack as much. It's not just about Robert Quinn. It's about the defense as a whole. When you have extra blitzers coming from places that you don't always expect from the Bears defense, that should help Khalil Mack.
Yeah, and guys, I want to get back to Erase the Hate in his question, or her, I'm not sure which it was. But to put a cap on the Khalil Mack stuff, you got to remember, in addition to not having Eddie Goldman and not getting what you wanted out of Robert Quinn last year, Akeem Hicks has been 100% healthy for less than half the games in the last 2 seasons since, 2018. And he is a huge part of what allows Khalil Mack to be Khalil Mack working inside. Remember, Roquan Smith goes down, last year, what was it, the last 3 weeks or whatever with the torn pec. And Danny Trevathan, the first half of the season, was just playing his way back into shape, although he played really well. So a lot of what we get from Khalil Mack is going to depend on everybody around him. And if they just play to their ability, then that's when Khalil Mack is Superman. He doesn't need somebody else to do it for him. But if everybody else is doing their job, that's when he becomes almost impossible to deal with. So, Kyle, I apologize. I forgot that other question.
It was they were asking for a little insight on Trey Roberson, how he looked the last few days at camp.
Sean, I got to defer to you because, to be honest with you, there's so many cornerbacks to watch out there. I can't say I really noticed Trey all that much.
Well, yeah, that's the thing. I mean, they have a lot of guys out there, and Kindle Vilder was stealing the show a little bit. And just to go back to a question you had asked, Hub, but those 2 picks for Vilder were both against Dalton. But I mean, the concern right now, the thing with Roberson is I don't know. I mean, it seems like he's going to be buried on the depth chart. I don't know that he's necessarily stood out to me, but we're dealing with a lot of guys. We're trying to keep track of a lot of guys. That doesn't necessarily mean he's not doing the right things.
Yeah, and guys, the expressions are, this is all done on grass. This is all done on air. There's no real contact. They're not wearing pads. And I realize you could say, well, with defensive backs, with everybody, it's like going full speed in a flag football game. It's just not the same thing. So, you're looking more for athletic ability and traits and tendencies. And I apologize because I know that there was a lot of excitement about Roberson last year. He's a local kid who he's got great size for a cornerback. He owned the Canadian League. That's one of the reasons the Bears went and signed him, last summer. And I will be trying to remember to look for him as soon as we get back to camp. But right now, there's just so many bodies out there. The other guy, Sean, I don't know. We take attendance. We do roll call to start these practices every day. That's how you find out Nettie Goldman isn't there, Quinn's not practicing, etc. I couldn't find Michael Joseph on Tuesday. Do you know if he was there?
I don't know that I've seen him at all this spring.
Yeah, I thought I had seen him. I thought during the first week of the OTAs, I thought he was, maybe he wasn't, come to think of it. But the forgotten guys are Joseph and Trey Roberson, who we just talked about, and Duke Shelley, who was the nickel when Buster Skrine got hurt last year. He made some plays. The Bears said they were encouraged by his development. I don't think Shelley has shown nearly as much in his short time as Vildor has in his shorter time. But those three, in trying to compete with Vildor and, again, all these veterans, Desmond Trufant, Tease Tabor, I'm forgetting Artie Burns. It's going to be fascinating to watch, and this is going to give these exhibition games some meaning, because even when you get the threes against the threes, this is going to be these guys like Roberson and Joseph, their chance to make the football team, Kyle.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's kind of hard in a 3-day window at the veteran minicamp here, and even OTAs. When you start stacking these practices a little bit during training camp, I feel like you get a better idea out of the secondary. But what I'd say probably after the second exhibition game, you'll have a much better feel for which of these cornerbacks are going to make the roster.
Yeah, and I'm going to guess even before that, by the time we get to that first game, just seeing how the reps are going in practice and seeing how they're performing, because there will be, and then now you got to get back to all the other goofy rules that the Players Association negotiated with this new CBA prior to the pandemic. I think it'll be the first 4 or 5 days there'll be no pads or no contact, but then there'll be a good 7 to 8 days of pads before we get to an exhibition game. And that's when we'll really have our kind of first idea of what these competitions are starting to look like. Now, we can't obviously go away, and we're running out of time here. We're coming up on almost an hour, but quarterback is the story. It's going to continue to be the story. Justin Fields is impressive on the football field. Matt Nagy got backed into some conversation I'm sure he didn't want to have, and I wasn't wild. I'm going to be honest with you. I wasn't wild about the way it happened, Sean. We've learned how to do this Zoom stuff, and every once in a while, you get somebody with an agenda, or you get what I'll call a radio stunt, and we had one on Tuesday. Mark Silverman, Sylvie and Waddle, they're dear friends, and I love Sylvie. But in this particular case, a guy who has, to my knowledge, never been in a Zoom conference with the Bears since we started doing this, is suddenly there asking the last question. And he came up with something about they pulled Matt's quote from the Collinsworth podcast or something like that, where he said that Justin Fields was not going to be the opening day quarterback. And he wanted Matt to say unequivocally that there was no chance that Justin Fields could start on opening day. And Matt tried to diplomatically talk his way through it and handle it as best he could. And in essence, what he said was Andy Dalton is the starter and Justin Fields will not be the opening day starter. But he stopped short of saying there is no chance that Justin Fields will be the opening day starter, which obviously opened the question to me. So I came back on Wednesday and had to ask it. Matt, I feel bad. I know you don't want to do this, but you opened the door yesterday. We all want Andy Dalton to be healthy. We want everybody on the team to be healthy. But if for some reason Dalton was unavailable for the opener, injury, test positive, whatever it may be, if Justin Fields is the number 2, does that mean he starts the opener? Or then do you have to reevaluate and look at Nick Foles? And Matt was less than thrilled with me for reopening the door again. That was clear. But he said he understood it wasn't acrimonious or anything. And again, he talked around it, but he explained. He said, I want to say it again, that right now, and I'm paraphrasing, not quoting, but what he said is right now, Andy Dalton is number 1, Justin Fields is number 2, and Nick Foles is number 3. So if it happened right now, we would go to our number 2, which was a way of saying that Fields could start on opening day without saying it. But he then immediately followed before the next question by saying, however, we tell these guys every day that they are competing to be the best they can be, and we are watching that every day. So in essence, what he's saying is that there's no competition for their spots on the depth chart, but they are competing every day, and they're trying to work their way through this without getting backed into any corner. And, Kyle, I think that's understandable, but it's also kind of the nature of the beast here that we're going to continue to hear these questions and this debate right up until the final gun of opening day. And
then probably right after the game too.
Oh yeah.
He's Matt Nagy is as much as he is going to kind of roll his eyes and grumble through it sometime, which is understandable. You get tired of being asked those questions. They're not going to stop. He knows that. He's made it clear the plan is Andy Dalton is going to be the week 1 starter unless there is an injury. I would assume, just sounding it sounds like Justin Fields will be the guy. Don't know what is going on with the Nick Foles situation. We talked about it was kind of weird going into this veteran minicamp about him not being at OTAs. I don't know really what else to say to people at this point. That they have a plan, and outside of injury or Justin Fields just going completely bonkers and forcing their hand, which is, like I said, there's a better chance the Bears are probably playing in Arlington Heights in 5 years than that happened. I feel like at this point they have a plan in place. It's going to be Dalton.
Yeah, and Sean, here's what is intriguing about this is that this is the reason I had to ask the question is, Justin Fields needs to be able to prove that he is a better quarterback than Andy Dalton in order to get the starting job. And in essence, what they're saying is that there's no way that can happen by opening day. But with the exact same line of thinking, he would also have to prove that he's a better quarterback than Nick Foles, because there is no evidence that I'm aware of that Andy Dalton is any better than Nick Foles. And so the reason they don't want Justin Fields starting is because he is an inexperienced rookie and they want to learn from the sidelines a bit. So it wouldn't make any sense that Andy Dalton is guaranteed the opening day start, but that if he's not available, that then it's okay to go with Justin Fields. By that line of thinking, you'd almost have to go to Nick Foles for the same reasons.
I would think that they would in that situation, but I don't know their thinking necessarily. I do know part of part of Nagy's quote, I believe that was on Wednesday, he said, the plan is not going to change tomorrow. The plan is not going to change in training camp. So that sure makes it sound like, Justin Fields is going to be the number 2 through training camp, barring any sort of injury like we're talking about. And, he also kind of, in so many words, said that he does, he's tired of answering the question, but it's going to keep coming up. Like we say, he's been through this enough. He went through it all of last training camp. This is going to be a topic every day until it's not anymore.
Justin Fields gave insight yesterday too, as to why he's going to be the backup for week 1. And when he was talking about learning the language, getting the play calls, that he openly admitted it's a lot more in depth than it was at Ohio State. That what he is recording the play calls, saying them out loud into a voice recorder, and then sending them to his coaches at night. Is that what he said?
Yeah. So he said he gets the practice plan the night before, and then he basically just at home in his house or wherever he's at right now, he says the play calls into a voice recorder, practices saying them, sends them back to the coach for feedback, and just doing the play calls in the huddle is a big change for him. From you go from college at Ohio State where you see these guys look into the sideline and there's 3 backup quarterbacks doing hand signals in a college game, and now he's getting that in his headset and he's having to relay that to the guys in the huddle, and that is a big focus this spring, of just getting the right cadence down and being able to communicate with the other 10 guys on your offense.
There's no doubt in my mind that physically he is already probably ahead of where Andy Dalton and Nick Foles are, but there's a lot more that goes into being an NFL quarterback than the physical tools. And at least for those first few weeks, that this is a reason why they're sticking with this plan. They have this plan in place.
Well, and I think a couple important clarifications here. First of all, the quote, I believe almost exactly from Justin, was that he never called a play in the huddle at Ohio State. He's never done it before. And so do you want him practicing in the first game of the regular season? No, of course you don't. And the longer, the more action he can get in the exhibition season will help. But even continuing to watch how it's done and hearing it during the regular season for 3, 4, 5 weeks, that's why almost none of these kids start on opening day. Excuse me, for that reason, more than anything. And then you have to plug in, he also said that the Bears terminology is I don't know how to put it, deeper than most. He said some of our play calls have a lot of verbiage or whatever he said. So that's a big part of it, but it's not all of it. And then another important clarification for what Sean just said is that, the plan's not going to change, but Matt's never told us what the plan is. He's conspicuously avoided telling us the plan. He just tells us what the depth chart is right now. Those are 2 separate things. And that's where you start getting into all this semantics and interpreting, about the things he said and what he really means. I do want to give credit where it's due, guys. I think Matt's been great with all this. Sean's right. You can see in his face, and Kyle, you mentioned there's some frustration. Sometimes he's got to go over it again, but he's patient. He's calm. He explains it as best he can. I don't get any sense of any bad feeling. If there was, tough, that's our jobs, but I don't see any of that. And then the last point, Kyle, off of what you just said, it takes 5 minutes out there to see that Justin Fields is in a different stratosphere athletically than Andy Dalton and Nick Foles. It takes 4 minutes to see that he's got far more arm talent than either one of them. I mean, this kid's got a cannon, and it is really impressive when you see some of the throws he makes. But it also only takes 3 or 4 minutes to see he does not have nearly the touch that both Andy Dalton and Nick Foles have. And that's a whole different thing. That's another thing that separates these rookies from everybody else. And it's one of the main reasons that some of them never make it. And so he's got the arm strength. He's got great timing and some accuracy on deep balls, but he's still got a lot to learn about, throwing these middle and underneath routes. And so it's all part of the process. Why almost never, I talked about this on the Score Friday morning, is, I'll give you obviously Dan Marino, Ben Roethlisberger, and Russell Wilson. Find me one other quarterback who started opening day as a rookie and was a success in the NFL. Now, of course, immediately Bernsey went for Justin Herbert. Number one, he didn't start opening day. He started week 2, or actually, I think he started week 3. I think the injury to Tyrod Taylor that the doctor caused was week 2. And it was out of necessity. And he put up great stats. But again, that was with a rebuilding team. They had cut loose Phillip Rivers. They had committed to him. The Bears expect to contend. The Bears need to contend to keep the pressure off of all the aging veterans and off of the general manager and the head coach. And your odds of doing that with a rookie are dramatically greater than they are with doing it with a game manager of a veteran. And that, more than anything else, after we have all this conversation, is why I just don't think you're going to see Justin Fields until at least week 5, week 6, week 7. And even then, only if the Bears are, below 500 or kind of muddling around and looking like they're not going to contend.
Yeah, I don't know if I agree to be week 5, 6, or 7. I mean, it could be later. It could be earlier. I really don't know how this is going to play out. I don't know. Sean, do you have a better feel?
They're keeping it so tight to the vest. It's hard to get a real read on what they're actually thinking.
Well, and here's the point, guys. Let's forget who the better football player is. Based on where everybody is at, the GM, the coach, the aging veteran players, if they're 3-1 or 4-2, why would you start Justin Fields?
Andy Dalton isn't playing well. I mean,
if they're 3-1 or 4, Andy Dalton isn't good. Andy Dalton's not very good. I'm sorry, but
I get it.
I'm not coming off of that. Anybody who thinks you're getting more than a game manager is just kidding themselves. But if he's managing games, if they have a really good running game, which looks like a possibility, and if now with upgrades, theoretically at wide receiver and tight end, I'm really fascinated by this Jake Butt signing. I don't know if he can still play. He's had 3 ACLs, but this kid was special coming out of Michigan. So, even if Andy Dalton is just Andy Dalton, which is all you hope for, if they are above 500 and contending in that division, I don't see why you'd go to Justin Fields.
I mean, it depends on how they're winning games. If we're talking there, let's say after week 3, they're 2-1, they won 2 ugly games, 13-7, 13-10, something like that, where they were able to get a late touchdown, defense played well, and a game that they lost because they didn't feel they were good enough at quarterback. I think the window opens, the earliest it really opens outside of an injury is week 3 for Justin Fields to take over. If Andy Dalton is playing decent, I think you are right, Hub, that window gets pushed back to week 6, week 7. And if he continues to play well, they're not going to make a change until they really feel that Justin Fields gives them a clear chance to win. That's kind of the timeline I have in my mind.
Sean, because the last word on this one.
If you're winning with Andy Dalton, I don't think that they would make a change in that situation, because that's what it comes down to. Whether you're winning ugly or not, if you're winning, you can make the argument that sure he might look terrible, but they're winning in spite of him. But I don't think that they're going to care. I think if they're winning football games with Andy Dalton, they're going to stick with him.
Well, and I lied. Maybe I'll grab the last word here, only to point out, in addition to everything else, winning is the key. If you're winning with Andy Dalton and he's not playing well, you change quarterbacks. That's going to have an impact on every other guy on that offense who you were winning with. It doesn't just impact the quarterback position. And so, you saw what happened with the Dolphins last year. They went to Tua. They had to bench him, even though he wasn't playing that badly. Then they went back to him when Fitzmagic, got dinged, and it became a problem for Tua. It's why people are actually talking about trading him during the offseason, even though he didn't play badly as a rookie, because of that unfortunate exchange. Where they had him on, they took him out. Is he ever going to get it? So I just think that you risk not so much, but you risk enough potential damage that I just don't think you make the move to Fields unless you're losing football games. And you say, much like Mitch Trubisky wasn't supposed to play year 1, and yet here he came at the end of in the middle of the 4th quarter, week 4, because Mike Lennon had just thrown 4 picks and ends up starting the rest of the season. But that team was going nowhere. The hope is that this team is going somewhere. So I just don't think you see the rookie as quickly as you think. Maybe just a closing thought from each of you, Kyle.
I mean, the team is probably going nowhere if Andy Dalton is not playing well. I mean, that's what it comes down to here. I don't know. I'm getting to the point now where we're speculating so much. I don't know what else to say about it. It's like I said, I think the window opens week 3. I don't expect to see him until probably week 5 or week 6, based on how I feel about Andy Dalton and how I think this team is going to operate.
Sean?
Yeah, my closing thought is let's get ready for training camp in 5 weeks. We got a couple of weeks off here. Things will slow down, but I'm excited to get going here.
Yeah, guys, I'm not going to guess as to when the window opens because I don't know how Dalton's going to play. And B, I think if it's early enough in the season that they do have to consider Foles before Fields, only again based on what they think the team's chance of contending is. But there's other strange stuff going on with Nick Foles. I don't know how the guy that you guaranteed almost $20 million and gave up a 4th-round pick for a year ago had to come in and compete. But Andy Dalton gets $10 million and comes in and is handed the job, and Foles gets dropped to number 3. There's more behind that curtain that we haven't seen yet either that hopefully we'll learn about in the coming weeks. So, guys, thank you so much to both of you, of course, and to our great sponsors at Heinz Lumber Company, 11 great locations around Chicago for all your building needs. They've been doing it for over 120 years, guys. It's the place that you want to go. And we want to thank most of all of our listeners. Thank you so much for joining us and participating. And remember, you can go to your app store, you can go to iTunes, you go shawlocal.com and download a subscription to our podcast. And we will look forward to visiting with you again next week right here from shawlocal.com and Bears Insider.